You mentioned the New South Wales Volunteer of the Year Awards, and last year we awarded that gong to a wonderful man who did amazing work, who is doing amazing work in his community. I would like to introduce you to Andrew Heslop, who is the founder of Neighbour Day, Australia's annual celebration of the community. Andrew started Neighbour Day in 2003 after he discovered or heard about the body of an elderly woman who was discovered at home 2 years after she'd passed away. While Andrew did not know the woman, he was appalled by the apparent ease in which the world had left her behind. Neighbours had watched piles of mail, store catalogues and newspapers build up at her front door, but did nothing. Not that you blame them, we've just become such an isolated society, we've fallen into I won't interfere mode, when in fact it behoves all of us just to ask, and that's not interfering. Widespread local and media interest followed, and it was this coverage that prompted Andrew to suggest a national check on your Neighbour Day in a letter to the editor in March 2003. And on Sunday, 30th of March 2003, the first Neighbour Day was observed, and it generated a surprisingly widespread media coverage and support, primarily because of the simplicity of the idea and the ease with which Australians everywhere could take part. Importantly, it also brought to prominence a major issue faced by everyday senior Australians. So on the last Sunday of March each year, Neighbour Day breaks up with street parties, barbecues, festivals and other social activities to encourage residents to get together. All we have to do now is convince council that street parties are not a threat. It's okay to stop the cars for a day. So it is with great pleasure that I get Andrew up here to talk to you about Neighbour Day, which is quite remarkable, and encourage you all to follow his lead and just keep an eye on your neighbours. You don't have to be a busybody or poke your nose in, but just observe those letters, that strange behaviour that is not normal, and just ask a nice question, are you okay? And it might make such a huge difference to people. Welcome, Andrew.
Good afternoon. Well, you're going to be quite amazed to know that Paula Duncan and I didn't sit down and write our speeches together because we say remarkably the same things, which I think goes to show that we're both on the same page and that everyone in this room this evening is on the same page. So Valerie Hoogstad, Chair, and Lynn Dalton, the CEO for the Centre of Volunteering, Award Ambassador Paula Duncan, distinguished guests who are also volunteers, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to acknowledge that our gathering here this afternoon is being held on Aboriginal land and recognise the strength, resilience and capacity of Aboriginal people in this land, whose traditional owners are the Camaragal people. Imagine for a moment the following scene. You're 31 years old and travelling in the country when you come across bloody devastation. There are bodies strewn in every direction, blood gushing from fierce wounds, lives slipping away, the gut-churning whine of indescribable pain and agony. Utter carnage. You go for help to the nearest town and raise the alarm, bringing residents with you to tend and care for the injured. Using rudimentary supplies and one of the most basic first aid skills at hand, your task is not to help your task is not just to help the strong survive and give dignity to those who will not, cannot. Pardon my stumble. As far as the eye can see, 38,000 men are wounded, dying or already dead. This is the scene that confronted the Swiss social activist, writer and businessman Henri Dunant in northern Italy. His compassion and empathy for the dying soldiers, his ability to rally the residents as volunteers, and his determination to set up field hospitals so they could bring care and comfort was both visionary and world-changing. Yet the volunteers, at first, were conflicted. They were being asked to care for men who were also the enemy. But Dunant pleaded with them to consider a higher purpose. Tutti fratelli, he told them. Tutti fratelli is, very roughly translated, we are all brothers. The date was June 1859 and the carnage was the aftermath of the Battle of Solferino, long before electronic communications and today's instant conversation of Twitter. Last Wednesday was the 185th anniversary of Jean-Henri Dunant's birth, a day that is celebrated around the globe. You may never have heard of him, but you will have heard of the organisation he co-founded, for which he also received the first Nobel Prize for Peace, as well as for initiating the first Geneva Convention, the first of many to determine the laws of war, which is what is and is not acceptable during armed conflict. Any guesses for the name of the organisation? Well done. It is the Red Cross, the world's largest volunteer organisation, and among the oldest, which this year is celebrating the formation 150 years ago of what is now known as the International Committee of the Red Cross. That part of the organisation you most often see on TV news from war zones and other areas of conflict. Today it's active in 187 countries and has 97 million volunteers, supporters and staff who deliver services and programs governed by 7 fundamental principles: humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, unity, universality and voluntary service. I'm telling you this story because the Red Cross is why I'm standing before you today. My late grandmother, during and after the Second World War, was a passionate Australian Red Cross volunteer. A nursing sister in Adelaide while my grandfather was overseas with the RAAF, somehow she managed 2 children and working to find time to volunteer as well. After she retired from nursing, it was her life. And as a child, I recall her going off to do things for the Red Cross, an organisation she passionately loved and respected. My late mother was also a teenage Red Cross volunteer, then later helped out in the tuck shop and with reading classes when I went to school. So when I joined Red Cross at primary school when I was 8 and volunteered for Australian Red Cross at secondary school during the annual Red Cross Calling Door Knock appeal, I became one of the 43% of us who become a volunteer because we have witnessed our parents doing so. Which is why volunteering is leadership, because only 23% of Australians will be bothered to do it if our parents can't be. My grandmother's influence drew me to Australian Red Cross, where not only had I been a volunteer, but I've also had a career, including with British Red Cross in London, and finally as their National Communications Manager in Melbourne. Very happy days, despite leading our response to the Tampa and September 11, where our own volunteer Yvonne Kennedy from Sydney sadly lost her life in the plane which hit the Pentagon. It's been the base for the volunteering roles I have had with the fundraising committee at my school, as well as with the Victorian Relief Committee, chairing the annual Winter Blanket Appeal, as an Australia Day ambassador, a champion for the National Broadband Network, a champion for the National Compact, the Australian Government strategy for the not-for-profit sector, as an outreach partner in the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and as a local ambassador for Jamie Oliver's Global Food Revolution Day, which is coming up this Friday. And that's all about eating local and eating well. In doing so, combating obesity and related illnesses by junking the junk. It's about leadership too, by showing our kids how easy it is to both grow and cook your own food. Something I'm really pleased Stephanie Alexander has done through her kitchen garden program in schools. When I was named 2012 New South Wales Volunteer of the Year in December, I did an interview with Network 10's The Project. I'd never really considered how much volunteering is part of my everyday life, until they read out a list of some of the things that I'm publicly known to be involved with as a volunteer. In addition, as Lynn said, to managing Australia's annual celebration of community, Neighbour Day, after hours and on weekends. I'm told from the outside it seemed a lot, but for me it isn't. It's just my life and I make room for each. Conflicting deadlines and priorities often have to be juggled, but in this, I'm just like you. I get an enormous thrill and an amazing sense of satisfaction from seeing how my actions, in partnership with others, are helping to drive real change in the community. Yet the most rewarding aspect of being New South Wales Volunteer of the Year has been meeting volunteers from across the state. In Yass, Wollongong, Tenterfield, Queanbeyan, Newcastle, Cooma, I've met volunteers from all walks of life, some delivering high-profile services, others doing it quietly without fuss. All passionate about making their communities a better place, a stronger place, by working with others. And really, isn't that, at the very heart of it all, what volunteering is all about? A team effort. The Macquarie Dictionary defines a volunteer to be someone who enters into any service of their own free will, or who offers himself or herself for any service or undertaking. And that's certainly all of us. On Monday with Minister Dominello at Parliament House, we launched the Statement of Principles for employers across New South Wales to protect the rights of this state's 2 million volunteers, with 12 high-profile organisations becoming the first signatories to this groundbreaking initiative. The Statement of Principles for the Recognition of Volunteer Rights embeds fairness, respect and dignity for the women and men who contribute 240 million hours of voluntary work each year, which has an estimated economic benefit of $5 billion. Women and men always dedicated to the task at hand, making a real difference, even when it means getting out of a warm bed in the bitter cold of winter to help another person in distress, helping the homeless, rescuing a victim of a car accident, providing emergency foster care accommodation for a child suddenly without the loving embrace of their parents. I endorse the Statement of Principles because too often there is a disconnect between the expectation of a volunteer and the intention of an organisation. As a volunteer delivering services, as a volunteer board member, and as an executive across a number of organisations, I have witnessed how the absence of clarity has transformed what should have been a positive experience into a negative one. So I congratulate Lynn Dalton on bringing the principles to reality in partnership with Minister Dominello to ensure every New South Wales volunteer receives fairness, respect and dignity. We all know the high-profile work of Australian Red Cross, the Rural Fire Service, St John's Ambulance, Marine Rescue New South Wales and the SES, who have teams of trained volunteers able to assist and respond at a moment's notice to protect us. But as Paula said, we don't often see the equally valuable and important work by volunteers who deliver Meals on Wheels, take library books to the elderly, or coach our kids in sport. As well, there are the parents who roster themselves for the walking school bus to get the neighbourhood's children to school safely, or who are there to do the sports shuttle to practice and matches, or provide food and blankets to the homeless each night. Then there is the iconic CWA, and also Blaze Aid more recently, helping farmers recover and rebuild after fire and flood. And not to forget, the thousands of volunteers in communities across Australia who get together with the people next door, across the street, or on the next farm to organise Neighbour Day events in suburbs and towns. So this week, as we say thanks a million to the 2 million volunteers across New South Wales, I challenge residents across the state to think about just how an hour of their time could help strengthen our communities and improve the lives of our neighbours. Australia has a fine history of volunteerism and putting others first. On Thursday 3 weeks ago, communities across the country paused to remember our nation's first volunteers, the brave young men who voluntarily stood up for Australia and the British Empire almost 100 years ago. Brave young men who put their communities first and headed off to war, planning a triumphant return home after beating the enemy. In a country of 4 million people, 416,809 enlisted, 38.7% of the male population aged 18 to 24. But 58,961 volunteers never came home. At dawn, their service to their community was remembered at the memorials constructed to the fallen in towns, suburbs and cities, the length and breadth of Australia. Memorials that mark their passing, but which can never adequately record the pain and the loneliness of the wives and the mothers, sisters and daughters who never saw them again, lest we forget. You and I know we are never too young or too old to be a volunteer. We're never too past it to pass on our skills, our experience and our knowledge to someone older or someone younger. We are never too old or too young to learn. It's why I take great pleasure in launching the 2013 New South Wales Volunteer of the Year Award, as we search the state to seek out and recognise women and men who are making a real difference in their community. We want to know about the quiet achievers, as well as those who are well known for what they do, to celebrate how their efforts are making their suburb, their town, and in doing so, New South Wales, a great place to live, to work, and to raise a family. For entry details, come to the website, newsouthwalesvolunteerawards.com. Let me end by saying thank you to each and every one of you for the collective hours and days that you, individually, put in as a volunteer. Thank you for putting others ahead of yourself and sometimes your families, because you know deep down it's the right thing to do. Without you, our communities would not be as strong, and they certainly would not be as resilient. Thank you for being leaders in a space where sometimes people forget to say thank you. Thanks a million.